The boy's hands were still shaking when he pulled the photograph from the ashes. The edges curled like singed leaves, the emulsion bubbled, yet the image survived. A German officer, cap tucked under his arm, eyes softened in a way the uniform did not permit. A young Polish woman beside him, chin lifted, a woven wrist charm peeking from her sleeve like a secret. The village around them gone. Charred beams, a cracked well, smoke stitched to the sky. He should have been her enemy. She should have feared the boots, the eagle, the orders. But the camera caught what orders never could: tenderness, forbidden and disobedient. His name, the archives would later whisper, was Oberleutnant Lucas Hart. On paper, he was precise: patrol schedules, rail lines, quotas. In truth, a second ledger lived behind his eyes, one that tallied lives spared, not lives taken. He had already crossed a line, then stood there, daring the world to notice. If you looked closely, you could see ash on his sleeve, as if he had tried to carry something out of fire and failed. Who took this photo? Who hid it? Why did everything else burn, except this proof that enemies are not always what the flags say they are? If a war is built on clear faces of good and evil, what happens when one face refuses to stay simple? And if one officer was a hidden rebel, how many others chose silence as their shield? The photograph doesn't answer. It asks, and it pulls us into the night where the truth began to glow, faint and dangerous, like a coal that would not die. Lucas Hart woke before the horn every day. He liked the few minutes when the forest still belonged to wind and birds, not to boots and rifles. From his window, he could see the village in its small valley, crooked lanes, a brick church with a roof like a sagging hat, one stubborn birch leaning over the well. In reports, this was just a waypoint in occupied Poland, 1942. In reality, it was a place shaped like a hell breath. It should not have survived. The patrol routes braided past it. Partisans tested the tree line. SS detachments rumbled through like storms that never rained. Yet the houses were still standing, patched, quiet, defiant in the way a candle is defiant. He had filed the numbers properly: grain requisitions, head counts, curfew infractions. He wrote like a careful clerk, because careful clerks were invisible. But there was a second version of the village he did not write: a map of faces, not streets. The baker with flour that clung to his cuffs like frost. The old woman who carried prayers in her pocket and bread in her sleeve. The boy who tracked troop movements the way other boys track birds. And her. He hadn't known her name then. He knew the danger of names. He called her the girl with the river eyes, because when she looked at him, things moved he couldn't control. War rewires the mind. It turns you into a gate that mostly closes but sometimes opens. The first time Lucas opened, it was barely a crack. A cold afternoon. A side lane where the mud remembered everyone's shape. A young woman slipping by the garrison fence with a basket heavy enough to bend her shoulder. He checked her papers, saw the false stamp instantly, and felt the nearest sentry's eyes on his back. Inspection, he said softly, so softly it could pass for a cough. He lifted the cloth. Beneath potatoes, tin milk, sulfa powder, a folded piece of linen stained brown. That brown. Someone was bleeding. He should have held her. He should have called for an escort. He should have been the uniform, not the man. Instead, he let the cloth fall and let his voice become the shape of a warning. You dropped something. He pointed to the ground, an empty place. She understood. She nodded like a prayer had been answered and walked away in a line that pretended to be casual, which was safer than pretending to be brave. He was not the only person who saw. Occupations breed eyes. A neighbor who watched windows. A soldier who collected rumors like coins. A child who ran errands to the wrong doorstep. That night, Lucas felt their glances crowd the ceiling like moths. He lay awake and listened to the garrison talk itself hoarse about a partisan cell in the next county. They think courage is loud, he wrote later in a margin he would burn. Sometimes courage is the quiet refusal to say a name. Morning brought routine wrapped like barbed wire around the hours. He walked the checkpoint, measured fuel, signed receipts, nodded at a staff car he despised. Order, the colonel liked to say, tapping the table with a baton as if rhythm alone kept nations in line. Lucas nodded because nodding meant surviving long enough to do the small disobediences that saved actual lives. An altered route, a delayed raid, a requisition that accidentally missed a barn where two families slept under hay. The village had a way of signaling itself, if you were listening. Laundry lines grew heavier on days when people were hungry, as if cloth could hold appetite. The milk pail at the well rang twice instead of once when a stranger approached. A door left open by the smith meant the road beyond it wasn't safe. This was battlefield psychology, logistics, and love of place woven together. In World War II history, this hardly gets a line. In life, it is how villages survive, a code book that looks like chores. He saw the girl again 2 days later, at the church that had lost its bell but kept its echo. Snow fell without commitment, like it had somewhere else to be. She lit a candle for someone who would not come home. He stood behind the last pew because officers did not come forward in places like this. They haunt the edges. When she turned, their eyes met in the small fire. There are moments that burn a hole through the safest habit. This was one. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She studied him the way you study a stranger who knows that you know what he did. Outside, the wind printed a pattern in the snow that looked like writing. "You will be noticed," she said, eventually. "Noticed is how men die here." Her Polish was blunt and clean. He answered in her language with the accent of a man who had learned it in university halls, not in kitchens. "So, we must not be noticed." He didn't say the rest, and yet we just were. What is a village but a theater where everyone pretends not to see the play? He should have let the silence be the last word. Instead, he asked a question that could end him. "Who is bleeding?" Her head tilted, not like a threat, but like someone testing weight. "A child," she said. "We have nothing left to stop infection. Unless you count luck." He knew the numbers the way you know your own pulse. Rations down 30%, patrols up 20%, winter kill likely if supply trains kept arriving late. He also knew where the garrison kept an extra crate of medical stock, stamped and logged and never to be touched. "I will ask for requisition approval," he said at a volume that could be heard and misheard by whoever needed to. Which is to say, absolutely not. That night, he learned 2 facts. 1. The padlock on the medical crate had a hairline crack exactly where a patient man could press and make it reconsider its fate. 2. The corporal who counted stock counted like a man who preferred beer to arithmetic. Lucas placed a box on a shelf so dusty it had to be invisible. When he left the storeroom, he was carrying exactly what the ledger predicted. On paper or held. In the drawer by the back door, a key had fallen. On the shelf where dust agreed to keep secrets, sulfa powder waited for a hand that knew it had been invited. He told himself this was a single kindness. Just one. He told himself a single kindness could hide inside a large cruelty without changing the shape of the war. He was wrong. Kindness is a solvent. It finds the seams. It softens the glue. Soon he was postponing searches with an extra cigarette, walking the long way around a certain cottage, pulling his men back 10 minutes early on nights when rumor said a courier would pass through the orchard. He found reasons. Invoked weather. Cited broken axles. He was forging paperwork with nothing but vocabulary. With every small act, the village learned to breathe again. Quietly, not fully, but enough. And the village noticed. Which is to say, people noticed because villages are made of eyes and hands, not roofs. The baker left an extra roll at the fence one morning, still warm. The old woman touched her brow with 2 fingers as he passed, a blessing disguised as a scratch. The boy tracked birds again. Lucas began to exist in the negative space of their gratitude, which is the safest place to stand. Of course, danger also noticed his absence. A sergeant named Weber watched him with the flat patience of cat. Weber's loyalty to the regime was simple and animal. It kept him fed. He liked to collect things, pocket watches, medals, and people's tiny mistakes. One evening, Weber said, "You walk these streets like you're counting something I cannot see." Lucas smiled. "That is because I am counting you." Weber laughed, too loudly. Laughter is a way to mark territory. It echoed in the narrow lane and made the snow look thinner. On the 7th day after the inspection, Lucas found a mark carved into the birch that leaned over the well. Just above reaching height, a small triangle, fresh wet in the cut. He had studied resistance signals in training with the smugness of a future occupier. Triangles meant warning. He stood there longer than he should, which is always how warnings become invitations. Behind him, a footstep. He did not turn. "There's a crate where there should be no crate," the girl said. "If someone were to make it visible at the right hour, a door might open where there is a wall. A plan should be drawn with straight lines. This one had curves." He told her, carefully, that he had heard a rumor that on Thursday the guard at the back door would be posted to the front to help unload an officer's trunk. The rumor was a rumor because he had just whispered it to the logistics sergeant as if it came from above. Rumors, like birds, move where seeds are. "If a certain friend of yours can carry twice their weight," he added, "they should be near the back door at exactly the hour the trunk arrives." "What do you want in return?" she asked. "You people always want something." He paused, felt his words before he let them out, as if testing water with his wrist. "I want to live in a world where that child does not die because I was afraid of a ledger." She studied his face for the lie and did not find one she could prove. "Then stop saying the word rumor," she said, and disappeared like wind does, a presence that refuses to be seen leaving. Thursday came as if it had been waiting its whole life to prove him a fool. The officer's trunk arrived late. The front guard did not move when he should have. The crate at the back was heavier with the weight of consequence. Lucas stood in the corridor and felt a clock beating in the floorboards. He signed for the trunk with his left hand, so his right hand could be where it should not be. The key was exactly where clumsiness had dropped it last time. The door opened with the sigh of a throat that had kept a secret too long. Shadows shifted. A figure slid into the room, light as regret. He could not see her face, but he knew her by the way the air tipped. She lifted the crate like it was a promise she refused to break. Then, footsteps. Weber's laugh at the end of the hall, clattering like tin. Lucas closed the door carefully, then loudly, so sound could become camouflage. He stepped into the corridor, barked something about inventory for anyone who needed to hear him be the uniform. Weber squinted. "You count so well," the sergeant said. "Perhaps too well." Lucas shrugged the way men shrug when they are bored by a man who thinks he is interesting. The trunk lid creaked. A moment later, the back door clicked open and closed. The corridor exhaled. The rumor had done its work. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt the ground tilt a fraction toward the future where everything falls once it starts. He had crossed lines so quietly that even he hadn't heard his boots on them. Now the sound was unmistakable. Betrayal to someone. To command, certainly. To the men who believed the war still had rules. Maybe even to the idea that you can stay clean in a world that punishes soap. He stood by the window as dusk folded the fields in half. The village looked almost kind under the soft light. Smoke curled from the chimneys like handwriting. He imagined a child breathing easier because of the white powder he had made visible. He imagined, too, the ledger on the colonel's desk, the red ink that could be poured into the margins of a man's life until it drowned him. When Weber left the garrison that night, he took the long way through the square, past the church, past the birch, past the well. His eyes touched everything like a thief choosing. Lucas whispered, not noticed, as if the words could be a wall. The wind took the phrase and tore it into 3 meaningless pieces. In the distance, a dog barked once, then twice, then stopped. Someone had shushed it. Silence after a warning is a kind of countdown. He felt it begin, tick by tick, tight as wire. The village should not have existed. Not like this. Not with kindness threaded through occupation like contraband lace. Lucas knew that places survive until the day someone writes their name on a list. He also knew lists were being prepared always, everywhere, by men who measured power in columns and totals. Whose ink would find this valley? Which signature would turn its roofs to black ribs? And when it came, what would he save first? The girl with river eyes, the child he had never seen, or the part of himself he had not yet admitted was human? He saw her again by accident, though later he would understand there are accidents that behave like invitations. The snowmelt had turned the road to syrup, and a wagon had cracked a wheel by the mill. Soldiers were out, barking orders over a problem they didn't actually want to fix, while the locals stood at a distance with the practiced posture of people pretending to be invisible. Lucas had been sent to restore order. What he restored instead was a truth he could no longer outrun. She was there, hood lowered, sleeves rolled, palms braced against the broken axle. She looked like she was trying to stop the wagon from sinking into the earth, and maybe in a way she was. A child clung to her skirt. Soot smudged one cheek like a fingerprint. She caught Lucas looking at her, not with fear, not with gratitude, just knowing. Weber arrived a moment later, swagger folded into suspicion. "These people don't move without reason," he muttered to Lucas. "Watch long enough and you'll see the strings." Lucas had already seen the strings. He just wasn't holding the right knife to cut them. The sergeant barked at the villagers, then kicked a bucket only to prove he could. The child startled. She put her arm in front of him so fast, it was instinct, not thought. Lucas stepped forward, speaking before Weber could draw more blood from the moment. "Enough. The road must be cleared before the supply column arrives. Unless you plan to push the wagon yourself." Weber scowled. "Backing down isn't defeat if you pretend you were bored." He waved a hand and stalked toward the barracks, muttering. The girl watched him go, then returned her gaze to Lucas, not thankful, not softened, just subtracting. Measuring who he really was, not who the uniform insisted he be. The wheel needed a stabilizing brace, but what had to be fetched. Lucas gestured for the others to fall back. When they were far enough not to hear, he said quietly. The crate reached its destination. She studied him, jaw tense. "The child is breathing. That is all you get to know." The words were clipped, but her eyes softened half a second late, as if compassion outran suspicion but was tugged back by memory. "You should not be here in daylight," he murmured. "And you should not be helping people your reports say do not exist," she answered. "There are sentences that are more dangerous than bullets." That one lingered like heat near powder. "Names are dangerous," he said carefully. "I still don't know yours. Then you are safer than you think." She walked around him to enlist two men for leverage. Lucas felt the space she had occupied like a warmth that shouldn't have been allowed under winter. He left before Weber returned, but her voice followed him like echo caught in fabric. "You should not be helping people your reports say do not exist." That night, he couldn't sleep. His bunk felt like a confession booth. His breathing too loud. The garrison's walls had ears, and his silence had become a sound of its own. At midnight, he went outside, pacing the perimeter, watching frost form on the fence posts. The moon traced the ground like a searchlight. He found himself at the birch tree, not consciously, but fate often walks more confidently than footsteps. A new mark had been carved there, a second triangle beside the first. This one wasn't warning. This one meant trust. It was a risk that tasted like invitation. Maybe that's why he followed the sound he should have ignored. A rustle in the trees, a figure stepping into half-light. She wore a shawl the color of earth. No gold thread, no ornament. Survival does not dress pretty. She stopped before she was near enough to be accused of anything. "The road was cleared," she said. "And the child?" "Sleeping." A pause. "Not dying." He absorbed the words like heat finally reaching bones. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, but the tone was not gratitude or suspicion. More like disbelief that compassion had survived inside enemy cloth. He answered carefully. "There are things a war can command, and things it cannot." That sounds like something a priest would say. "I'm not a priest." "No," she said quietly. "Priests don't carry rifles." He looked at her hands, pink from cold, bruised at one knuckle. "Who teaches you to risk like this?" "No one," she said. "The world teaches us by taking something first." Silence stretched. Not hostile, not warm. Simply the weight of two worlds colliding where they should not. He said, "If they see you here, they won't," she interrupted, "because you will walk the other way and pretend the night is empty." "And what will you pretend?" "That there's someone on the inside who still remembers how to be human." The line cleaved through him. He almost asked her name again. Instead, he said, "You need to go." "So do you." She slipped back into the tree line like she was made of shadow. Lucas stood rooted. He realized then, this had already gone too far. The ledger in his head had begun keeping score in blood that wasn't spilled yet, but would be if anyone linked them. By morning, gossip had crawled through the garrison like smoke. A crate gone. A patrol irregularity. Someone soft. War does not need truth, just suspicion. That week, Weber lingered more. That week, Command asked more questions. That week, Lucas began memorizing the way death enters a room before orders do. Then came the moment that rewrote everything. A courier arrived from county headquarters with sealed directives. Weber fetched the colonel. Lucas stayed behind with the courier, who was warming his hands by the stove. Out of reflex, old academic habit, Lucas glanced at the satchel stitching, the wax, the smudge of coal dust fingerprint. The courier was not what he seemed. Wrong boots, wrong insignia placement, wrong eyes for a man delivering reports, too alert, too hungry. And Lucas understood. This was no courier. This was a hunter. Someone had reported a sympathetic officer. Someone had named him. He stepped closer before instinct could register as disobedience. "Who sent you?" he asked, tone low. The courier smiled in a way that meant, "I know you know." War had just turned its face toward him. Not eventually. Now. But was it headquarters that had sent him, or the resistance, sniffing out a traitor in reverse? Which side wanted him exposed first? And which side would kill him faster? The girl had warned him. Men die here when they are noticed. Someone had decided to notice. A moment later, the colonel returned, and the satchel was gone from the boy's hands as if it had never carried a threat. But Lucas no longer believed anything was safe. The countdown had begun, and he didn't yet know. The next time he saw her, someone else would be watching too. The first sign wasn't a question. It was a silence. People spoke to Lucas less that week, not out of fear, but calculation. In occupied land, silence is a barometer. Too quiet means someone is measuring loyalty. The baker stopped leaving extra rolls. The old woman kept her blessing inside her sleeve. Even the birch at the well seemed to stand straighter, as if waiting for something to snap. Lucas knew surveillance before he could prove surveillance. The human body always knows first. Skin pricks, throat tightens, instincts circle like patrol dogs. A man watched isn't observed from afar. He is compressed from all sides. Hallways narrowed. Footsteps echoed wrong. Eyes lingered a fraction too long. Turning corners felt like stepping onto a stage built from suspicion. And beneath all this, the courier, whoever sent him, had not finished. One night, returning from inventory, Lucas saw a shadow detach itself from the garrison wall. Not a soldier, too still. Not a villager, too bold. A watcher, in uniform, following at a distance. He didn't turn his head. To notice is to confess. He walked slowly, cleanly, making his posture behave like innocence. He could have turned back. Instead, he walked toward the tree line. A dangerous choice. He needed to know if they would follow him where death had branches. They did, which meant they were not watching him for theft or smuggling. They were watching him for contact. The forest does not echo like streets. It absorbs sound. When he stopped, breath held in the hollow of his chest, he heard it. The soft misstep of a man trained for war, but not for woods. A city-spined soldier. Clumsy. Eager for proof. Proof of what? That was the question that now stalked him. Was he being hunted as a traitor to Berlin? Or tested as a traitor to the underground? Enemies have categories. Traitors have none. The next night, he altered his route, and the watcher altered with him. The trap was tightening. But it was the third night that drew the noose, because that was when he saw her again. The village was already half dark when she appeared near the abandoned shed behind the mill. Her shawl was pulled tighter than the cold required. Her shoulders braced, not like someone hiding, but someone deciding whether to trust fate a second time. "You should not have come," Lucas said softly. She didn't flinch. "Then you should not have been followed." For a moment, the world froze, not from weather, but from consequence. She knew. He didn't ask how. Wise men don't interrogate the people keeping them alive. "There is someone behind you," she murmured. "Yes," he answered. "I am aware." "Which side?" she asked. "I don't know." That answer changed everything. If he had said theirs, she could have decided he was too dangerous to protect. If he had said ours, she could have decided he was manipulating her. But I don't know is not uniform speech. It is human speech. Walk, she said, and began to move, not toward the village, but toward a thinning of trees. He followed, not because he trusted safety, but because he trusted her urgency. They walked in silence until the watcher's footsteps faded behind distance or indecision. It was impossible to tell which. When they stopped, they were deep enough in the woods that stars bled through the branches. "Someone has named you," she said. He nodded slowly. "And someone has protected me, at least twice." "You think that was me?" "No, I think that was your network." She didn't deny it. "I am not your enemy," Lucas added. "That is the most dangerous thing a man in your boots can say," she replied. He stepped closer, not close enough to touch, but close enough that breath meets breath. "And yet you are standing here." She matched his stillness. "Because I'm trying to decide whether you are a door or a trap. And I haven't decided yet." Something flickered in him. Fear, but also something alive. Something he had not allowed to breathe in months. "Tell me your name," he said quietly. "No," she answered, equally quiet. "Not while you still could be taken from me by paperwork." Their eyes remained locked, her stare steady, his heavy, the distance suddenly charged with the weight of a war neither of them fully believed in anymore. Then, she did something she had never done before. She asked him a question. "Why are you here?" "Not in this forest, here, in this war." The answer rose before reason could strangle it. "Because I saw what our victory looks like and I could not stand inside it anymore." She inhaled slowly, reflexively, because this was no longer a conversation. This was confession. And confession is the closest thing human beings have to a key. He continued, "I cannot leave the uniform yet, but I can interfere with what it is allowed to do." A long silence fell. When she finally spoke, her voice was not guarded, only sad. "You are the kind of man history tries to erase, because you do not fit the script. And you are the kind of woman empires fear," he answered, "because you do." Something broke open between them. Not tenderness, recognition. The rare moment when two people realize they are not strangers meeting for the first time, but mirrors meeting late. She lowered her gaze to the ground, to a thought, to a choice. "You are being watched more closely," she said. "Soon they will demand proof of your obedience." He knew this. He also knew what came next. A test. And tests in wartime are never about paperwork. They're about blood. "Then we must move carefully," Lucas said. "No," she corrected. "We must move faster." She turned to leave, then hesitated, just enough for the future to slip through her voice. "I will come back in 3 nights. If you are still alone, I will tell you my name." That was not a promise of romance. That was a promise of alliance. The last thing she whispered, barely air, was not instruction, but truth. "You are not protecting this village anymore. This village is now protecting you." And with those words, she vanished into the darkness that made her braver than soldiers with guns. Lucas watched the trees sway after she was gone. He did not know that someone else had seen the meeting. He did not know that a second report had already begun to write itself. He only knew one thing. The next time he hesitated, someone would die. And soon, someone would force him to choose whose life would pay for mercy. The warning came not as a siren, but as a paper that smelled of ink and authority. It arrived on a gray morning in a courier's satchel, 2 pages stamped, signed, and folded in a way that said finality. Orders for reprisal measures against villages suspected of aiding partisans. Thin justification. Thick appetite for terror. The colonel read it aloud in a voice that used every word like a hammer. Lucas listened as if the syllables were nails being driven into the village he had been loosening at the seams. "Collective responsibility," the colonel said, looking around the room like a man naming a game. "We answer with firmness." No one asked which lives would be taken to prove the point. He had expected this eventuality in the abstract. The doctrine was always clear. 1 village burned to deter 10 uprisings. History textbooks list percentages. Reprisals aim to reduce partisan support by measurable fractions. Reports show a predictable pattern. Burnings correlated with short-term drops in sabotage, but infinite human cost. But what the books could not teach him was how ash feels under your fingernails when the fire is in the place you taught yourself to call safe. That night the garrison prepared as if it were harvest. Lanterns, ropes, oil drums arranged like instruments tuned for cruelty. Men moved with the same competence with which they had made the ledger run. Methodical, obedient, certain. Weber walked with a smile that had teeth. He liked lists. He liked outcomes. He believed in the arithmetic of punishment. "We sent a message," he said, as if messages were not bodies. Lucas watched them load the trucks with a hand that did not tremble until the wheels hit the road. He could have stopped it then, refused a signature, reported a different priority, invented a missing engine. He had, until this morning, believed small acts could bend the arc of large policy. Now the paper was stamped, and the colonel had the pen. At the gate, the driver waved for him to sign the last manifest. His pen hovered. He thought of the child with the sulfa powder and the woman who had the river in her eyes. He thought of the baker and the old woman's blessing. He thought of the birch with its carved triangles. He signed. Guilt is a heavy thing, but guilt plus intent is heavier. He told himself, if later anyone asked, that he had signed a watch to be able to track method for mercy. He told himself this in the way a drowning man tells himself water is only temporarily cold. They arrived before midnight. The village looked smaller than it had on paper, as if reduced to the size of human endurance. A wind that smelled of river and rot moved through the lanes. Lights in windows blotted out with palms. People were asleep in houses that creaked with memory. Men in uniforms fanned into alleys. Weber was all grin and purpose. Orders slid across the night like knives. The first house they broke into belonged to a widow who kept hens and songs in equal measure. They dragged her into the square and made the ritual. Accusations, names shouted until sound flattened into nonsense. 2 soldiers lighting the first barrels. Her one word, why, was softer than the match. When flame licked her shutters, she sang the hymn she always sang, and the voice did something dangerous. It refused to fit the shape they were making. A soldier shoved a torch into a crate. Someone else kicked in a door. The air filled with a smell that will live in some people's dreams forever. Singeing wood and the iron of fear. Lucas moved through this like a man walking through his own nightmare, set to order. He gave commands he did not want. He opened gates he had closed for reasons no longer practical. He watched Weber watch. Weber watched with the simple math of obedience. 1 torch equals 1 lesson. The trucks roared. The flames took on their own appetite, a mouth that did not ask permission. He searched the houses with the thoroughness of a man cataloging scandal. In one attic, he found a child pressed into a trunk, breathing like someone who had folded themselves small enough to hide from history. He carried that child out. The soldier at his elbow barked. "What are you doing?" Lucas said, "Move him to the church." The soldier hesitated. "You will regret this," he said. Words like this are not threats. They are records. Lucas ignored the ledger. He lifted the child and felt the small weight of a life he could not sign away. At the far end of the square, as the smoke stretched into the sky like a new horizon, someone motioned at a shadow. It moved with the kind of secrecy that makes soldiers speak in clipped tones. A woman slipped from a doorway, shawl wrapped, hair loose in the way of sudden escape. Lucas saw her, a flash of recognition like a mirror. He knew her hands, the way she carried nothing but what she needed. She looked at him for a single second. There was no time. Her eyes said the only thing that could be said. Run. He wanted to reach her then, to step forward and become what he feared and what he had been building toward. But to step forward there, to take her from the square, would be to carve his name into the colonel's ledger. Instead, he moved like the rest, professionally, efficiently, while inside his ribs something fractured. Reports later would record that the village resisted. They recorded small arms fire, as if the noise could be quantified into a footnote. They would write of casualties, 10 insurgents, 2 civilians, casualty lists with numbers that looked tidy in a column. They would fail to record the cost of a hymn cut off in mid-phrase or the look of a child who slept forever. They would omit the photograph. He found the photograph where he never imagined such proof would be. Someone's pocket, among ration cards and a prayer book, singed at the edges but intact. The image was the same. Him, cap removed, smiling slowly, the woman beside him leaning in the way people do when they have too little time. For a suspended second, the world stopped being charcoal and became memory. He reached for it, fingers shaking. A soldier grabbed his arm. "That's contraband?" the man asked, not friendly. Lucas said nothing. He wanted to say everything. He did not. They took names, numbers, left trays of ash where meals once had been. They set up a perimeter, and while the men counted for damage, they appointed a ledger for the ones who had caused it. That would go on a list to justify the burn. That listing would become paperwork that, later, would make the act lawful to the men who obeyed. By dawn, the village was a skeleton of what it had been. The church a black hollow, the well a crater, the birch half-charred but still standing like a witness. Smoke crawled low across the fields, a carpet of grief. A few survivors staggered from the rubble, like people who had been repurposed into ghosts. Lucas stood at the edge and watched them gather what could be gathered. A spoon, a child's shoe, a shard of porcelain. The child he had saved hugged his knees and asked only one thing. Is it over? He wanted to tell the child many things, reasons, excuses, an answer that would fit in a pocket. He could not. "We will try," he said, which was both true and meaningless. They buried the burned with practical swiftness. Weber watched the ceremony as if it were a parade. He made no secret of his satisfaction. Later, in the aftermath, an officer from headquarters visited to assess compliance. He asked Lucas questions with a pen like a scalpel. "Did you follow orders?" he wrote. "Yes," Lucas said. He could not, in that room, say the other truths. That he had pulled a child from a trunk, that in a pocket he had found a photo, that his hand had trembled over signatures. He left the village with soot permanent under his nails and ash in his throat. The photograph stayed in his coat that day like a coal in his pocket. When the truck rolled away, the boy who had once run like birds at the edge of the fields pressed his face to a window and watched the village disappear in the distance. Lucas watched that boy watch. In the boy's eyes, he saw something he had tried to keep from seeing all along. The village had given him a debt that no ledger could balance. He would be summoned later. Reports would be written. Weber would find a way to make the world small enough to live inside. But in the hollow of Lucas's hands, he still held something unburned, a photograph that refused to justify the fire. What does a single image ask of a man who has signed away his moral ledger? Who pays for the mercy he tried to give? The official report said the village was pacified. That was the word, pacified. The kind of word a regime uses when it wants the world to believe silence is peace. The pages that followed recorded fuel consumption, ammunition use, estimated insurgent count. But there was one thing they did not record: the boy. The boy who had crouched behind the broken fence and seen Lucas slip the photograph inside his coat like a man rescuing a heartbeat. Command summoned Lucas 2 days later. He stood before a tribunal that was not a tribunal. Just 3 men and a verdict already written in their eyes. They asked no questions about mercy or children saved or hymns that stopped mid-breath. They asked about timing, patrol gaps, suspicious delays. "You have become lenient," the senior officer said. Lenient was their word for human. The colonel tried to defend him, not out of loyalty, but because paperwork hates losing a competent cog. It didn't matter. A file had already been opened. Both sides were watching him now, Berlin and the underground. They reassigned him to another sector pending evaluation. In war, reassignment is either exile or prelude to burial. He didn't know which yet. He carried the photograph in his breast pocket because he did not trust any drawer not to be searched. At night, he breathed into his hands until they trembled less. He waited. For what? He couldn't name. He never saw her again. Not in that winter. Not in the thaw. Not in the surrender. She vanished the way resistance fighters do. First from the street, then from the whisper, then into the part of history that has no surname. Years later, there would be testimony that a woman matching her description joined a cell that sabotaged a weapons depot. Other rumors said she escorted children through forest corridors into safety. Another claimed she was captured under an alias and died without speaking. Records split her into ghosts. Her name dissolved into bravery. Or maybe survival. Or maybe both. Lucas was arrested in the final year of the war. Charges: defeatism, insubordination, complicity through omission. They could never prove contact with the underground, but suspicion was enough. In a collapsing empire, suspicion is the last currency. He was court-martialed, stripped of rank, transported to a holding camp for disloyal officers. Irony. The regime he disobeyed sentenced him for not obeying more. He survived barely, thin as memory, carrying the photograph stitched into the lining of his coat like a last lung. After liberation, he did not return to Germany. He drifted. Men who discover conscience late often do. He worked borders, then hospitals, then nowhere. Friends said he lived as if someone were still watching, but no one knew who. Survivors rarely speak of the person they failed to save. And the photograph, carried through relocations, hunger, sickness, eventually slipped from his life somewhere between flight and forgetting. It vanished as quietly as she had. But history has a strange gravity. The things it loses are never fully lost. They wait. The boy who survived the burning village became the custodian of its ghosts. He grew into a man who carried memory like a stone, hard, unsmoothed. When the war ended, he collected remnants from the rubble: a hinge, a scorched spoon, the iron heel of a boot. And then, one morning, sifting through ash after a storm had loosened soil, he found it. Half buried, edges blackened, image still alive. The same photograph Lucas thought he had saved instead by the earth. The boy, now grown, took it as a testimony that refused to burn. He spent years chasing fragments, archives, depositions, officials who wrote everything except what mattered. What he learned was never a full story, only the outline of two lives that had collided where law said they should not. But the photograph did not need the missing chapters. The pose said enough. She leaning slightly closer than safety allowed, he looking at her as if war had not yet rolled its iron weight over the sky. It was not romance printed on paper. It was rebellion, soft rebellion, the kind strong nations fear most. Because it suggests the enemy is not a creature, but a choice. And choices can cross walls. The man, no longer a boy, eventually donated the image to an historian who treated it not as evidence of love, but evidence of disobedience. This is what war tried to erase, he said. Human exception. It traveled again, through archives, through hands, through invisible guardianship, until it reached a display case in a museum that did not list names because none were confirmed. Only the caption, "Unknown officer and unknown woman, found after reprisal burning. Exact relationship, undocumented." Undocumented. The most elegant synonym for truth that frightened somebody. Visitors who passed the case lingered longer than at the artillery maps or uniform displays. Because bullets explain war, but faces explain cost. Some called it tragic. Some called it dangerous. Some simply stared at the way her eyes leaned into his. And Lucas? History does not know where he died. Only that after the war he visited Poland once, alone, and stood for a long time in front of a field where nothing remains but grass and a surviving birch, crooked, still scarred where two triangles were carved 70 years before. Some witnesses say a man cried there once. Others say the wind only sounded like a man grieving. Maybe both are true. We never know whether he found her, or whether she ever learned that he survived. War severs endings. Some stories must finish without a door closing. But here is what matters most. Everything burned, except the image of two people who refused to become what war scripted them to be. When an empire tried to erase their existence, the earth itself held the receipt. The photograph outlived the fire, and in doing so, it outlived the lie. Some stories survive not because history protects them, but because memory refuses to let them drown. If you want more untold human truths, the textbooks left behind, stories rescued from ash and silence, stay with this channel. The next one waits in another forgotten photograph and another unanswered name.